Good evening, everybody. Oh, yeah, you made it. Couple people anyway. Yeah, so thanks for joining in. I've been slogging away the last couple weeks. I've been working on this big paper that started off digging into the Lego robotics and their digital wallet gaming app for kids and the World Bank and all this stuff. And so I thought I was going to write a little paper about Lego, and then it ended up now I'm sort of incorporating a whole entry point into like telepresence labor and impact of finance and hive mind consciousness and the noosphere, and it's getting to be almost 40 pages long at this point. So it's weighing on me a lot because I feel like it's so big, but I've gone so far, I just have to keep going. So anyway, it's nice to take a break every once in a while and just do a little bit of reading. So tonight, again, Rainbow's End, Werner Vinge. We're, I guess, getting close to maybe about a third of the way through the book. The last chapters that we did, I guess it was just last night, we had an episode where essentially they lined up a zombie graduate student that the holographic rabbit, which may be AI that's running the access to the biolab program, could access Robert Gu, the poet, through this graduate student. So they were going to set up a student who was a real student who wanted a thesis project. And he was in a literature. He's a graduate student in literature in University of Portland, I think, or in Oregon State University. And so they were going to get the student to sort of provide access point, not only for his own project, which was this thesis project, but to occasionally give the rabbit access. So that was part of it. And then Robert Gu is finally learning how to wear. So the wearable technology, which is the contact lenses for augmented reality and the smart clothes, and to figure out all the nuances of what it's like to engage with a virtual person. So this grad student came and showed up like in his bedroom and he was trying to navigate all of that. So that was sort of the logistics chapter about getting introducing the new character of the graduate student. And then they decided to go together, whatever that means, in one of these automated cars to the University of San Diego, California, San Diego campus. And because Robert Gu really loves real books, like actually paper books that you can hold. And this graduate student was like, oh, he works for 411, which is like the poetry information line or something. And he's like, oh, you should definitely go to the library because that's where you'd be able to see the most books. And so as the end of the chapter closed, they're accessing the library, but they're going in through the back because the graduate student says there's a big protest out front and he wouldn't be able to get in the front door. So so this is where we're entering chapter 11, which is called, yesterday was chapter 11, the introduction to the librariome, which is a mouthful to say librariome. Okay, so this one is chapter 12, and it's Guardians of the Past, Handmaidens of the Future. So, and thanks for a few messages there. It's nice to know people are out and interested. So I did just do a post, a tweet earlier today. I was just thinking, one of the reasons I wanted to try to do this is, it's very isolating here in Philadelphia just to be, it's still hard. But I know that you guys are real people out there. And I have these really wonderful memories of in my elementary school, we had a couple teachers in third grade and in fifth grade, and they would do these classroom read aloud novels, and everybody loved them because like you could read along with your book, but you didn't have to, you could just listen. And they were really great, sort of middle years element, like just core books. And, I remember at the end that the teacher would get ready to close the book and be like, I think we're done. And everyone would just like, beg. They would be, no, one more chapter, and we would do that. And Miss Nevey is my third grade teacher. Actually, she had, I don't know if we made it, like, I don't know if the parents made it. It just appeared. It was a cardboard geodesic dome in the back of the classroom that had carpet squares, and you could go read there. So, anyway, I'm just rekindling my love of reading, and it's I don't do it as much anymore, right? Just straight up reading fiction, and certainly not reading aloud. So thanks for playing along and humoring me in this little project. Okay, so chapter 12, again, Guardians of the Past, Handmaidens of the Future. From its beginning, the elder Cabal had met on the sixth floor of the Geisel Library. Winston Blount, calling in favors from his years at Arts and Letters, had made that possible. That had been after the Rose Canyon quake, when the bright young future freaks had been briefly leery of their own technological fixes, and floor space was available to those willing to risk the heights. In the first years, there were almost 30 regulars. The membership had changed from year to year, but they were mostly faculty and staff from the turn of the century, almost retired or laid off. Time passed and the cabal dwindled. Blount himself had drifted away from the group, discovering that there weren't many more favors left for him to call in. His plans for a resumed career had centered on the Fairmont adult education program. Then the Orozco boy had unintentionally pointed him at a magnificent shortcut, the librarium protest movement, and the inner circle of the cabal was perfect for that. Perhaps it was just as well that the inner circle was exactly the cabal's entire remaining membership. Tom Parker was sitting right beside the window wall. He and Blount peered down upon the protesters. Parker chuckled. "So, Dean, you going to go down and preach to the choir?" Blount grunted. "No, but they can see us up here. Give the folks a wave, Tommy." Blount followed his own advice, raising his arms in a kind of blessing among the singers at the main entrance of the slightly smaller mob on the terrace by the snake path. In fact, he had offered to speak at the demonstration. In the old days, he would have been a featured speaker, and now he was still a critical player, but of zero publicity value. He flickered through some of the images that glowed above the crowd. My, this event is big. Layered, in fact. But some of the layers were counter demonstrations, obscene ghosts that capered through the crowd to mock them. Damn them. He turned off all enhancements and noticed that Parker was grinning at him. "Still trying to use those contact lenses, aren't you, Dean?" He patted his laptop computer lovingly. "It just goes to show you can't beat the genius of a mouse and Windows environment." Parker's hand slid across the keyboard. He was working through the layers of enhancement that Blount had been seeing directly with his contacts. Tom Parker might have been the sharpest fellow left in the cabal, but he was hopelessly fixated on old ways. "I've customized my laptop to pick out what's really important." Images flickered on his tiny screen. There were things Winston Blount hadn't noticed in his contact lenses that someone had sent kind of a nimbus over the demonstrators. Impressive. Tommy was still chuckling. "I can't tell about that purple halo. Is it supposed to be pro or anti-librarium?" On the other side of Parker, Carlos Rivera leaned back from the window and stretched. "Anti, according to the journalists. They say the halo is to bless the guardians of the past." The three watched silently for a moment. The sound of the choir came through the high glass windows, but also from the protesters around the world. The combined effect was more symbolic than beautiful, since the voices were very out of sync. After a moment, Carlos Rivera spoke again. "Almost a third of the physical visitors are from out of town." Blount grinned back at him. Carlos Rivera was a strange young fellow, a disabled veteran. He hardly met the cabal's informal age requirements, but in some ways, he was almost as old-fashioned as Tommy Parker. He wore small, thick glasses, the kind that had been popular in the early teens. He had typer rings on all his fingers and both thumbs, and his shirt was one of the old displayables. Right now it showed white letters on black. Librarians, guardians of the past, handmaidens of the future. But the most important thing about Carlos Rivera was that he was on the library staff. Parker was studying the numbers on his laptop. "Well, we've got the world's attention. Now, we spiked 2 million views a few moments back, and lots more will be watching this asynchronously." "Well, what does UCSD Public Relations say?" Parker typed briefly on his laptop. "They're lying low. The PR people would just as soon this be a non-event." "Ha, but they're getting pounded by the popular press." Parker leaned back and shifted into reminiscence. "There was a time I would have hidden my own cameras down on the lower floors And if they dead zoned me, I'd have broken into the PR site and pasted pictures of burning books all across their press releases. Dwi, said Rivera, nodding his head, but that would be difficult nowadays. Yep. Worse, it would take courage. Tommy patted his laptop. And the trouble with people nowadays is they've traded freedom for security. When I was a young man, the cops didn't live in every widget, and there wasn't some clown collecting royalties on every keystroke. Back then, there was no secure hardware environment, and it didn't take 10,000 transistors to make flip flop. I remember in 91 when I took down and then he was off on one of his stories. Poor Tommy. Modern medicine has not cured him of his need to tell about old adventures again and again. But Carlos Rivera seemed to love these stories, and he nodded every few seconds, his expression rapt. Blount sometimes wondered whether Rivera's enthusiasm should be held for or against the young fellow. So anyway, by the time they thought to check for crimps in the fiber, we had dumped all the files, and now for a wonder, Rivera was no longer listening. He had turned toward the stacks. His expression was full of surprise, and he rattled off something in Chinese and then thankfully slipped back into English. Please wait a moment. What? Parker glanced at his laptop. Have they started the shredders? Damn, thought Blount. He had been hoping that terrible moment could be marked by the protesters. Yes, but that was several minutes ago while you were talking. This is something different. Someone has gotten into the loading area. Winston bounced to his feet, bounced as much as semi-rejuvenated joints could be made to bounce. I thought you said there was security down there. I thought there was. Rivera came to his feet too. I can show you. Images popped into Blount's eyes, views from cameras on the north and east sides of the building, more views than he could make sense of. Blount waved the images away. I want to see this for myself. He plunged into the library stacks, Rivera close behind. If we had known about this could have put some of our people down there. This was a problem nowadays. Security was so good that when it broke down, no one was around to take advantage. In the back of Blount's mind, something marveled at his new priorities. There had been a time when Dean Winston C. Blount had been the fellow on the establishment side, doing his best to make sure that the know-nothings didn't bust things up. And now a certain amount of hell-raising might be the only way to set the establishment right. Has the choir seen this? Don't know. The best views were quarantined. Rivera sounded out of breath. They detoured around the elevators and staff rooms that occupied the middle of the floor. And now they were moving at right angles to the stacks. Far down the book-lined shelves, he glimpsed the sky beyond the windows. You said there was a chance that Max Huertas might show up today? Yes. But there's some chance he might come. Several libraries begin the project this week, but UCSD is the star. Huertas was more than just the money behind the librarium. He was also the major investor in the biotech labs near campus. He had turned the university scene upside down with his librarium project. Librarium insanity, ultimately greasing it past an administration that should have fought it to the death. Blount's jog slowed as they approached the windows. The UCSD campus had suffered a revolution in the last decades. The vibrant building campaign of his time as a dean had been swept away by the Rose Canyon quake and the facile logic of the modern university administrations. The campus had reverted to a woodsy, low-density style with buildings that might have just been prefab Quonsets. In a sad, sad way, it reminded him of the campus's earliest years, of his grad school years. We built such a beautiful place here, and then we let opportunism and remote learning and the damn labs dissipate it all. What shall it profit a university if it shall enroll 500,000 and lose its own soul? He reached the northeast windows and looked down. The 6th floor was at the building's maximum overhang. You could see almost straight down to a stretch of cracked concrete, the library loading dock. And there was a guy down there furtively looking around. Carlos Rivera caught up with Blount, and for a moment they were both staring downward. And then Blount noticed that the younger man was actually staring through the floor. He'd found some camera on the lower levels. That's not Max Huertas, said Carlos. He'd be coming with a gang of lackeys. Yeah, but it was someone who could persuade the library rent-a-cops to let him go down there. Blount tapped the glass. Look up here, you jerk. It was amazing what little he could see from straight up, and the stranger carried himself with a twitchy awkwardness, like an old-timer, coping with a regrown nervous system. Blount was beginning to get a very bad feeling. And then the stranger turned his gaze upwards, and it was like finding a large rat at your feet. Oh, Christ. A strange combination of disgust and curiosity forced him to say, just get him up here. After the sunny loading dock, the hallway seemed very dark. This is Robert Gu, the poet. Robert hesitated, adjusting to the light. The walls were streaked with scuff and scrape marks. The floor was naked concrete. This was not a public area. It reminded him of years ago when he and certain undergrads would sneak around the utility cores of the buildings. Epiphany hung tiny labels on the doors and the ceiling and even the cracks in the walls. They weren't terribly informative. Information, ID numbers, maintenance instructions, the sort of thing that might have been paint stenciled in the olden days. But if he wanted to take the time, he could search through the signs and get background information. And there were mysteries. A large silver puttied crack in the wall was marked cantilever limit cycle, more or less 1.2 millimeters, 25S. Robert was about to search that when he noticed a door decorated with a larger banner, one that had ticked out the seconds. 7 minutes and 3 seconds. Librarium equipment in operation. Keep out! Exclamation point. What the hell was this door? What the hell? This door was open too. And on the other side, the power saw racket was louder. He walked 50 feet past plastic crates, rescued data, the label said. And at the end, behind some kind of legged forklift, there was another unlocked door. And now he was on familiar ground. He was at the bottom of the library's central stairwell. He looked up, looked into the foreshortened spiral of steps, and tiny flecks of white floated and swirled in the column of light. Snowflakes? But one landed on his hand, a fleck of paper. And now the ripping buzz of the saw still louder, and there was also the sound of a giant vacuum cleaner. But it was the irregular ripping buzz that echoed down the stairwell and beat him about the head. There was something familiar about that, but it wasn't an indoors kind of sound. And he started up the stairs, pausing at each landing, and the dust and the noise were worst at the 4th floor, labeled Catalog Section PZ. The door opened smoothly. Beyond would be the library stacks, all the books you could ever want, miles and miles of them, the beauty of ideas waiting in ambush. But this was like no stacks he had ever seen. The floor was draped in white tarpaulin. The air was hazy with drifting debris. He took a breath. He smelled pine pitch and burnt wood, and for a moment he couldn't stop coughing. Brap, painfully loud now from 4 aisles to his right. There were empty shelves there, a littering of paper scraps and deep dust. Brap. Against logic, sometimes recognition comes hard, but finally Robert remembered the exact sound which that abrupt roar must be. He had heard it occasionally throughout his life. But always the machine had been outdoors. Brap! A tree shredder. Ahead of him, everything was empty bookcases, skeletons. Robert went to the end of the aisle and walked toward the noise. The air was a fog of floating paper dust. In the 4th aisle, the space between the bookcases was filled with a pulsing fabric tube. The monster worm was brightly lit from within, and the other end, almost 20 feet away, was the worm's maw, the source of the noise. Indistinct in the swirling haze, Robert could see 2 white-suited figures, their jackets labeled Huertas Data Rescue. The 2 wore filter masks and head protectors, and they might have been construction workers. In fact, this business was the ultimate in deconstruction. First one and then the other would pull books off the racks and toss them into the shredder's maw. The maintenance labels made calm phrases of horror. The Raging Maw was a Navicloud custom debinder. Oh, God. Navicloud custom debinder. That's terrible. The fabric tunnel that had stretched out behind it was a camera tunnel. Robert flinched from the sight, and Epiphany randomly rewarded his gesture with imagery from the monster. The shredded fragments of books and magazines flew down the tunnel like leaves in a tornado, twisting and tumbling. The inside of the fabric was stitched with 1,000 tiny cameras. The shreds were being photographed again and again from every angle and orientation until finally the torn leaves dropped into a bin just in front of Robert. Rescued data. Brap! The monster advanced another foot into the stacks, leading another foot of empty shelves behind it, almost empty. Robert stepped into the aisle and his hand caught on something lying on the shelf. It wasn't dust, it was half a page, a remnant of all the thousands of books that had already been sucked into the data rescue equipment. He waved it at the white-suited workers and screamed words that were lost in the noise of their shredder and the worm tunnel fans. But the two looked up and shouted something back. If the body of the glowing worm hadn't been between him and them, Robert might have rushed the pair, and as it was, they just waved impotently at each other. And then a third guy appeared behind Robert. This one was overweight 30-something, wearing Bermuda shorts and a huge black t-shirt. The young man was shouting at him in what, Mandarin? He waved pleadingly for Robert to follow him back toward the stairwell, away from the nightmare. The 6th floor of the library was not part of the nightmare. In fact, it looked pretty much as Robert remembered from the early 1970s. The guy with the big t-shirt led him through the stacks to the study area on the south side of the building. There was a short fellow with an ancient laptop computer sitting right by the window. The little guy stood and stared, and then suddenly he laughed and stuck out his hand. Well, I'll be damned. You really are Robert Goo. And Robert took the proffered hand and stood uncertainly for a moment. Book shredders below, the mystery man up here in this crazy choir, and he could finally see the singers in the plaza. You don't recognize me, Robert? No. The guy had lots of blonde hair, but his face was old as the hills. Only his laughter was familiar. And after a second, he shrugged and waited for Robert to sit down. I don't blame you, he chattered on, but recognition the other way is easy. You lucked out, Robert, didn't you? I guess the Van Kurosawa treatment worked 100% for you. Your skin looks better than when you were 25 years old. The old man slid an age-spotted hand across his own features and smiled ruefully. But how's the rest of you? You look a little twitchy. I lost my marbles. Alzheimer's, but hey, right, I can tell. It was the heedless frankness that Robert suddenly recognized. Behind the stranger's face, Robert recognized the freshman who had made his UCSD years significantly more exciting. Tommy Parker, the young squirt who could never be put down, who had been the computer science jock at UCSD before he had even graduated from high school, before there had even been such a thing as a major. The little guy who couldn't wait for the future. Tommy nodded, chuckling. Yep, but it's been Professor Thomas Parker for a long time. You know, I got my doctorate from MIT, and then I came back here and I taught almost 40 years. You're looking at a member of the establishment. And seeing what the time had done, and for a moment, Robert was silent. I should be immune by now. I mean, he looked out the window at the crowds away from Parker. So what's going on, Tommy? You're camped up here like some grand commander. Parker laughed and typed at his keyboard. From what Robert could see of the display, it was some ancient system. I mean, worse than his view page, and nothing like what he could get from Epiphany, but there was enthusiasm in Tom Parker's voice. It's this protest demonstration we set up against the librariome's menace. We didn't stop the shredding, but geez, look at that. I mean, I got your break-in on video. Tommy's display looked like what a telephoto image shot from the north of campus, a tiny figure that might be Robert Goo entering the library freight area. I don't know how you got past security, Robert. Management wonders that too, said the young man who rescued Robert. He sat down behind the front desk and brushed flakes of paper dandruff off his hair and t-shirt. Suddenly, Chad is bad slogans on his shirt made a lot of sense. He noticed Robert's regard and gave him a little wave. Hi, Professor Gu. I'm Carlos Rivera, library staff. His t-shirt morphed to white, which at least made the little bits of paper less obvious. You're part of this destruction? He suddenly noticed the half page he had waved from the shredder. He laid it gently on the table. There were words. Well, maybe he could figure out what they had been a part of. No, no, said Parker. Carlos is helping us. In fact, all the librarians opposed the shredding, except the administrators. And seeing that you got past library security, I think we must have allies even there. You're a famous guy, Robert, and we can use the video you got. But and Robert started to say he didn't have a camera. And then he thought of the clothes he was wearing. Okay, but you'll have to show me how to give it to you. No problem, began Rivera. You're using that epiphany junk, aren't you, Robert? Well, you have to get somewhere to help you. Wearables are supposed to be such a convenience, but mainly they're an excuse for other people to run your life. That's a good one. I'm going to just say that again. Wearables are supposed to be such a convenience, but mainly they're an excuse for other people to run your life. Me, I'll stick with the proven solutions. He patted his laptop. Though some fluke of memory, Robert recognized the model. 20-some years ago, this gadget had been the cutting edge of power and miniaturization, barely 8 inches by 10, with a brilliant millimeters-thin screen and a fancy camera. And now, even to Robert, it was a ponderous behemoth. How can it even talk to the modern magic? Parker's glance slid across to the librarian. How did he make it into the building, Carlos? Rivera says, Wobuji Dao? I don't know. I'm not good with that. Tommy groaned. You're talking Chinese, Carlos. Oops, sorry. He glanced at Robert. I was an army translator during the war, he said, as if this explained everything. I don't know how he got in, Professor Parker. I saw him walking in from Warchowski Hall, and I was using the same viewpoints as our security. But you notice that even after he got to the shredders, there was still no one to stop him. He turned and looked expectantly to the stacks. Maybe the dean has other people working on this. After a moment, the old man stepped out from behind the books. You know, I don't, Carlos. And he walked to the window without looking at Robert. Aha. So this is where Winnie's disappeared to the last couple of weeks. Blount stared down at the plaza for several seconds. And finally he said, the singing has stopped. They know about Gu's arrival, don't they? Yes, sir. Even though we haven't published it on our own video, there's plenty of journalists floating around. At least 3 popular sources have ID'd him. Outside, the crowd was cheering. Robert tried the little shrug that Juan had said would bring up the local news, and all he got was advertising. And Sharif was still silent. Sharif is the graduate student. After a moment, Blount walked back to the head of the table and sat down with a wheeze. He hadn't looked directly at Robert, and Winnie didn't seem nearly as confident as in Chumling's class. How long had it been since he had last played our little political game? Robert gave Blount a steady look. That should cause Epiphany to search on him. Also, in the old days, that look had always unnerved the guy. Okay, Blount nodded at Tom Parker. Tell our protesters to start the wind-up. You know, the interviews and the opinion pieces. Well, what about Mr. New Development here? Tommy jerked a thumb in Robert's direction. Blount finally looked at Robert, and Epiphany began streaming information across his view. Google biosource Winston C. Blount, M.A. English from UCSD, 1971, Ph.D. English Literature from UCLA, 1973, Associate Professor of English at Stanford, 1973 to 1980, Professor of Literature and later Dean of Arts and Letters, UCSD, 1980 to 2012. That's a long time. 32 years. Biblio speeches, favorite things. So Winnie, he said, are you still wheeling and dealing? The other face paled, but his reply was evenly worded. Call me Winston, or Dean Blount, if you please. There was a time when he had gone by Win. It was Robert who had cured him of that. They stared at each other silently for another second, and finally Blount said, do you have an explanation for how you got in the service entrance? Robert gave a little laugh. I just walked in. I mean, I'm the most ignorant of all, Winston. I mean, what had become of Zulfi Sharif? Tommy Parker looked up from his laptop. There is a recent public information on Robert Gu. Robert's been in deep Alzheimer's for almost 4 years. He's one of the late cures. He glanced up at Robert. Geez, man, you almost died of old age before you got well. And on the other hand, it looks like you've had great medical luck otherwise. So what brought you to UCSD on this of all days? Robert shrugged. It was surprising how much he did not want to go into his problems with Bob and Mary. I don't know, his timing is just a coincidence. I came down to UCSD because, well, I wanted to see the books. A not so friendly smile came to Blount's face. How very like you that you come on the day we started burning them. Rivera protested. It's shredding, Dean. I mean, technically speaking, except for the Chad, all the shredda is preserved. Robert looked at the torn paper he had brought from downstairs, shredda that had escaped its final resting place. He held up a forlorn slip of paper. Honestly, I don't know what's going on. What was this? What madness explains destroying the book this was a part of? Winnie didn't answer immediately. He waved at Rivera to pass him the fragment, and he set it on the table and stared. And for a second, his eyes grew a little wider. What a pleasant irony. They're starting in the PZs, aren't they, Carlos? Oui, the young man replied hesitantly. This, Winnie waved the paper in the air, is from a science fiction book. A grim chuckle. Those sci-fi bastards are getting just what they deserve. For 30 years, they had literature education hijacked, and this is what all of their reductionism has gotten them. Good riddance. He crumbled the paper and tossed it back at Robert. And Tommy grabbed the little paper ball and tried to resuscitate it. It's just an accident that science fiction came first, Dean. Actually, said Rivera, there are rumors that the shredders started in science fiction because there would be fewer complainers among the geeks. It doesn't matter. They were scheduled to be well on the other stuff by the end of the day. Winnie leaned forward. What do you mean we're scheduled? You didn't know? Parker patted his laptop again. Was he in love with that ancient device or what? The shredding ran into a minor technical problem, and they've shut down for the day. He grinned. The popular press said the minor technical problem is the sudden appearance of Robert in the middle of the operation. Rivera hesitated, and the light glinted in the depths of his thick eyeglasses. Yes, he said, so the crowd outside had something to celebrate after all. Winnie got up and looked out over the window again and sat down. Very good. We've earned our first victory. Relay our congratulations to the troops, Tommy. Robert raised his hands. Will someone please explain this madness to me? I mean, there may be nothing burning, but this does seem like a Fahrenheit 451. I mean, that's another science fiction story, Winston. Rivera waved vaguely. Search keyword librariome, Professor Gu. Robert gestured and tapped. How does Juan manage to do all this without looking like an idiot? Here, use my laptop. You'll never figure it out how to drag the news out of Epiphany. Winston Blount slapped the table. He can do that on his own time, Tommy. We have serious work to do. Okay, Dean, but Roger has changed things, and we can use his reputation. Rivera nodded. Yes, he's practically won every literary prize there is. Stuff it, said Blount. We already have 5 Nobelists on board. Compared to them, Gu is nothing special. Blount's glance flickered across Robert's face. The put-down he directed at Robert was accompanied by a minute hesitation, probably too short for the others to notice. The most important things about Winston Blount were not in his Google bio. Once upon a time, Winnie had thought of himself a poet. But he wasn't. He was merely articulate and the owner of a large ego. And by the time they both arrived as junior faculty at Stanford, Robert had lost patience with the poser. Besides, committee meetings would have been deadly dull if not for his hobby of needling Winnie Blount. The guy had been an unending source of amusement because he seemed to think that he could outwit Robert. Semester after semester, their verbal duels became more pointed. Winnie's failure more obvious. It hadn't helped the other's cause that Blount had no talent for what he wanted most, to create significant literature. Robert's lighthearted campaign had been devastating, and by the late 1970s, poor Winnie was the laughingstock, quietly the laughingstock of the department. All that was left of his claims to significance was his pomposity, and he had departed Stanford, and Robert remembered feeling satisfaction of having done the world a good deed when Blount found his proper place in the scheme of things, becoming an administrator. But he was probably just as good a poet as the new Robert Goo. I wonder if Winnie really knows that. Of course, Tommy Parker was oblivious of such undercurrents. He responded to Blount's comment as though it was a neutral statement of fact. Someone thinks he's important, Dean. Someone who had the power to slip him past some fairly good commercial security. He turned to Goo. Think back, Robert. I know you're new to this information scene, and Epiphany obscures an awful lot, but did you notice anything strange today? I mean, before you got to the library? Well, he looked into the air above them. His web search was just beginning to show results, texts, and pics about the Librarium Project, rescuing prehistory for the students of today. Well, that was certainly strange stuff. Otherwise, there were floating lights that meant various things. He tried not to remember Juan's explanations. Ah, Sharif was back, a ruby icon that hovered just over the corner of the stacks. I've had some help. A grad student named Zulfikar Sharif. Were you in contact with him as you came down towards the library? Yes, Sharif thought I would get in easier if I didn't try to walk through the crowd at the main entrance. Rivera and Parker exchanged glances. You didn't see the security ribbons. They should have been guiding you to the south side of the building. Professor, I think you are hijacked. Parker nodded. Don't feel bad about it, Robert. That sort of thing happens a lot with wearables. We should track down this Zulfikar Sharif character. Robert pointed to the ruby light. I think he's still here. The gesture must have been taken as a cue by his epiphany, somehow making the light a public thing. Rivera looked in the direction he was pointing. Yes, see that, Professor Parker? Tommy looked down at his laptop and messaged the touchpad. Of course I can see him. I bet he's listening via Robert. What say we invite him in for a chat? Blount was squinting around hopelessly. Evidently, he couldn't see the ruby glow. Nevertheless, he took the question as directed at him. Yes, do it. Robert tapped a release, a second pause. The ruby Tinkerbell floated down to the edge of the table and abruptly became a full-size human being. Dark skin with earnest eyes, Sharif smiled apologetically and shuffled through to the edge of the table to sit on a chair on the other side. Thank you so much for invoking me, Professor Goo. And yes, nodding to the others, I have been listening. Apologies for my various communication problems. I call that taking advantage of a beginner's ignorance, said Parker. Blount nodded emphatically. I would say so. And he hesitated and seemed to think it over. Oh, what the hell? What does it matter, Tommy? I mean, everything we're doing today is perfectly open. Tommy grinned. True, but the one thing I've learned from you is to always look a gift horse in the mouth. Sometimes they turn out to be the Trojan variety. He looked at the image on his laptop. So, Mr. Sharif, I don't care if you've been eavesdropping or not. Just can you tell us what you've been doing with Robert Goo? Someone led him down to the service entrance and through all sorts of security. Sharif smiled hesitantly. In all honesty, I was surprised as you about that. Professor Goo and I were talking freely when he arrived on campus, and he got rather quiet as we came down the slope from the Warwashaki Hall. And then, for no apparent reason, he turned left and we went around the north side of the library. And the next thing I knew, he was walking in the freight entrance and I lost contact. I don't know what more than I could say. I mean, my own wearable security is at the highest order, of course. He hesitated a moment and then changed the topic. Aren't you taking this whole thing in the wrong way? I mean, the Librarium Project will open up all past literature to everyone and faster than any other project could do it. What's wrong with that? This last was met with total silence. Winston Blount smiled thinly. I don't suppose you've seen our website. Not as yet. He paused and his eyes seemed to be looking far away. Okay, I see what you're saying. He smiled. I suppose I should be on your side. What you want will keep my 411 job safe. See here, I love old poets, but old time literature is so hard to get at. If your interest is in post 2000 topics, critical sources are everywhere and searches get results. But for the rest, you have to search through that. And Sharif waved at the orderly ranks of books and the stacks that filled the library's sixth floor. It can take days to even gather trivial insights. Lazy bum, thought Robert, and wondered at Sharif's earlier enthusiasm for real books. But he had noticed the trend even in his own teaching days. It wasn't just the students who refused to get their hands dirty. Even so-called researchers ignored the universe of things that weren't online. Winnie glowered at the young man. Mr. Sharif, you don't understand the purpose of the stacks. You don't go into the stacks expecting the precise answer to your burning question of the moment. It doesn't work like that. In all the thousands of times I've gone hunting in the stacks, I've seldom found exactly what I was looking for. And you know what I did? I found the books on close by topics, and I found answers to questions I had never even thought of. And that's so true. Just as an aside, that's really, really true. That's what I really remember being at Penn in grad school, and their open stacks, huge open stacks, and you could just wander and you would find things that you never knew. So that's very spot on. Those answers took me in new directions and were always more valuable than whatever I originally had in mind. He glanced at Rivera. Isn't that so, Carlos? Rivera nodded, a little weakly, Robert thought. But Winnie was absolutely right. So right that Robert had to say something on the same side. This is insanity, Sharif. Apparently, the library-owned project is someone's idea for photographing and then digitizing the library, but suddenly he was remembering things from his last years at Stanford. But didn't Google already do that? That's true, said Rivera. In fact, that was our first argument, and perhaps still the best one. But Huertas is a great salesman, and he does have arguments in his favor. What he had in mind is fast and very, very cheap. Past digitizations have not been as global or unified as this will be, and Huertas has lawyers and software that will allow him to render micro royalty payments all across the old copyright regimes without any new permissions. That's going to be that blockchain shit. Micro payments for you, micro use of digital commodities. Winnie vented a sour laugh. The reason the administrative people bought into this is that they like Huerta's money and maybe even the publicity. But let me tell you, Mr. Sharif, shredding destroys the books, and that is the bottom line. We will be left with a useless jumble. Oh no, Professor Blount, read the overview. The pictures coming from the camera tunnel are analyzed and reformatted. It's simply a matter of software to reorient the images and match the tear marks and reconstruct the original text in proper order. In fact, besides the mechanical simplicity of it all, that's the reason for the apparent violence. The tear marks come as close to being unique. Really, it's not a new thing. Shotgun reconstructions are classics in genomics. Oh yeah? Robert picked up the much-abused page that had been rescued from the PZ stacks, and he held it out like some limp murder victim. So what perfection of software is going to recover something that was torn from its binding and never photographed? Sharif started to shrug and then saw the expression of Robert's face. Sir, it's really not a problem. I mean, there will be some loss, true. Even where everything is properly photoed, the programs will make some mismatches. Potentially, the error rate can be less than a few words per million volumes, far better than even hard copy republishing with manual copy editing. I mean, that's why the other major libraries are participating in the project, to get accurate cross-checking. Other major libraries? Robert realized that his mouth was hanging open, and he shut up, and he couldn't think of anything else to say. Tommy stared at his laptop. You seem suddenly well-informed, Mr. Sharif. But, well, I am wearing, the young man said. Humph, and all you want to do is pursue your love of literature? Yes, my thesis advisor has based her entire career on Gu's Secrets of the Ages, and now I find out the great poet is back from Alzheimer's. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. Look, if you don't believe the Google bio, check in the 411 directories. I have lots of satisfied customers, many of them literature students at UCSD. Not that I give them an unethical amount of help. Aha. So maybe ghostwritten homework was still a no-no even in this brave new world. I don't know what happened with Professor Gu today, but it didn't slow down the library owned project. It did slow down the library owned project. Isn't that what you want? Blount and Rivera were both nodding in agreement. Yep, said Tommy. You're a horse of some kind. I am simply a lit in English student. Tommy shook his head. You could be almost anything. You could be a committee. When you want to sound like a lit lover, we get a chat from a member who knows about poetry. Tommy tilted back his chair. There's an old saying, the beginning of trust has to be in-person contact. That's really good. That's the blockchain stuff, the trust. And Jason always says that, right? That's a good one from Jason. So let me say, so there's an old saying, the beginning of trust has to be in-person contact. I don't see any usable chain of trust in your biography. Sharif stood and walked partway through the table. He looked upward, waving his arms at the sky. You want in person? That I can supply. Look down here at the bench by the footpath. Tommy tilted his chair still farther back and glanced over his shoulder. Robert walked to the window and looked down. Much of the crowd had dispersed, leaving just a few knots of die-hard demonstrators. The footpath was a tiled serpent that wound its way up the hillside, its head reaching just to the edge of the library and terrace. It was a very real mosaic, new artwork since Robert's years at UCSD. I came all the way from Corvallis just to see Professor Gu. Please don't turn me away now. And there by the path was a second Zuli Sharif. This one, not virtual at all. He was looking up at them and waving. So I guess that's where we get our digital twin. All right, I'm gonna have a quick glass of water. I hope you're enjoying this. It's interesting. It's interesting to read. So this is 2006, all the stuff that he's writing about. Okay, next chapter. Next chapter, the Miri gang is born. So Miri is Robert's granddaughter, and he's mean to her. For as long as Miri could remember, she'd had this problem with grandparents. Alice's parents, Alice is her mother, and Alice's grandparents, too, had all been living in Chicago, and not one of them had survived. On Bob's side of the family, Bob is the father, Robert had been almost dead, but then he came back, and now Miri was afraid she would be losing him all over again. And then there was Lena. Lena Gu was only dead on the record. Lena had persuaded Bob to set up that lie with friends of privacy. Lena even ordered him to keep the details from Miri, but Bob had told Miri what he was doing. That was smart because Miri would have figured it out anyway. This way, Miri was imprisoned by her promises to Bob. She hadn't breathed a whisper of the truth to Robert, even when they were still talking and he had been so desperate. But now Miri was getting desperate. She hadn't seen Lena in 5 months. Almost. She had called Lena after the Ezra Pound incident, but that would have only confirmed Lena's opinions of Robert, and Bob just wanted to ignore Robert's problems. Coward. Alice was no coward, but she was in deep training these days, and it wasn't going well. Okay, I can handle this on my own, Miri told herself. She conceived a clever rehabilitation plan working with Zuli Sharif. At first, that had been great. Sharif's wearable had been easy to subvert, and she had direct access to Robert. But after Robert's trip to UCSD, she realized that someone else was using Sharif too. It was definitely time to visit Lena. Miri waited till the weekend and took a car down to Pyramid Hill. The place was really busy on Saturdays, and Bob said it reminded him of the arcades of his childhood. You had to travel physically to the park, but once you got there, you could do touchy-feely with all the best games. It was run by Baja Casinos, but for kids not old enough to legally gamble. The important thing for Mary was that the park had pretty good security. Even if Robert got curious about where she was going, it was unlikely he could follow her uh, through to Lena. She unhooked her bicycle from the rack at the back of the door and she imaged it as a small jackass. Her own persona was classic anime: big eyes, spiky hair, tiny mouth. That should turn off anyone who might otherwise try to play with her. Mary walked her jackass along the path that circled the hill. She overruled the anime imagery to view what was most popular today. It was mostly a smoocha nonsense. Salsa peds and baba yagas were everywhere. A year ago, no one had heard of the Suchis, and now they were bigger than some of the corporate names. They had even dented the mega release of the latest Cretaceous returns, and there were hundreds of different types of Suchi characters. Some were slyly stolen intellectual property, and the rest were from folklores at the edge of the world. The imagery was very, very cheap without any creative center, and maybe that's why the little kids were the biggest fans. Near the top of the hill, a lesser Suchamut roared into the sky. That sound was not watts from some synthesizer. That departing Scoochamuth was how her view imaged the park's high ride. The ride capsule blasted from deep in the hill, 4 Gs before it coasted into the sky, giving its passengers almost a minute of 0 G before touching down in the park's annex. It was the most spectacular ride in Southern California. Nowadays, Mary's friends sniffed at it. Might as well be an UP-X package. But when Mary was little, she had spent more than one afternoon bouncing back and forth across the sky. Today, she got halfway to the east exit without choosing a particular game, and she was careful not to touch, much less ride, the mechs. She especially avoided the furry, cuddly critters, except at the exits. You touch, you pay was the rule at Pyramid Hill. Maybe she should buy into a game just to shed some of the marketing pressure. She paused and looked across the hillside. There was a lot of noise and action, but if you listened carefully, you could tell that the kids in the bushes were actually playing in another universe, all choreographed so that neither players nor equipment would get in each other's way. She had picked the right cover. Classical anime was just too highbrow for these dorks. How about twin spirits? You only need 2 physicals for that. Miriam was tripped over her jackass. She twisted around, putting the bike between her and the voice. There was a real person, also tricked out in anime costume. And Mary dropped into the true view, Juan Orozco. Talk about bad luck. She had never imagined he would be into classic anime. She found her voice, a trilly, high-pitched English thing that Annette Russell had given her. Not today, I'm afraid. I'm looking for something grander. Orozco, the spiky-haired critter he presented, cocked his head questioningly. You're Mary Goo, aren't you? This was majorly bad etiquette, but what do you expect from a 14-year-old loser? So I still don't want to play. She turned around and pushed her bike along the path. Orozco followed right along. He had a fold-up bike that didn't get in his way at all. You know, I teamed up with your grandpa in Miss Chumlig's composition class. I knew that. Boogers. If Juan learned what Mary was up to, then Robert might too. Have you been tracking me? That's not against the law. It's not polite. She didn't look at him, just stomped away very quickly. I haven't been watching second by second. I was hoping to run into you, and then I saw you coming in the west gate, so maybe he had just set up proximity alerts. You know, your grandpa is trying to help me, like with my writing, I think, and I'm getting better at it, and I'm teaching him to wear, but I feel sorry for him. He seems to be angry all the time. Mary kept walking. Anyway, I was thinking if he could get some of his old friends, maybe he would feel better. Mary whirled on him. Are you recruiting? No, I mean, I have an affiliate that could benefit seniors, but that's not what this is about. Your grandpa is helping me at school, and I want to help him. They were coming down the hill, approaching the east gate. This was the last chance for Pyramid Hill to make money. The closer you got to the gate, the harder the sell. Across all park-supported realities, furries danced playfully around them, begging to be picked up. So I guess if you touch it, you actually have to pay stuff. That's like the micropayment. in the spatial web. So furries danced around them, begging to be picked up. The critters were real mechanicals. If you reached out to touch them, you'd find plush, deep fur under your hands and real heft to their bodies. Near the gate, management wanted to sell these little robots, and free feel goodbye had swayed thousands of otherwise resistant children. When Mary was younger, she'd bought about a doll a month. Her favorite still played in her bedroom. She rolled her poor jackass through the crowd, avoiding the talking bears and the miniature Scoochemoots and the real children, and then they were out the gate. And for a moment, Mary fumbled and lost her imagery. And now she was just a plain fat girl, and her bike was a dumb machine. Orozco just looked skinny and nervous, and he had a shiny new bike, but he couldn't seem to get it unfolded. I don't want him to find out about Lena. She jabbed a finger at the boy's chest. My grandfather is fine, and he doesn't need to be recruited into some payoff scheme. Outside of school, you stay away from him. And she flashed imagery that Annette had created for their Avengers clique, and the boy flinched. But I just want to help. And furthermore, if I catch you tracking me, and she switched to a deniable mode and a delayed delivery he wouldn't see for several hours. Anonymous did want Orozco's silent message. If you really anger me, your school transcripts will look like you tried to scam them. Closed message. Juan's eyes widened slightly at the sudden silence. He would have had some time to stew over what was coming. It was all empty threat, of course. Mary believed in obeying the law, even if she might pretend otherwise. She ran her bike a couple of steps and hopped on and almost fell off, and then recovered and coasted down the hill away from Orozco. The Rainbow's End retirement community was a valley northeast of Pyramid Hill. The place was very old and famous. It had been founded 60 years ago, ages before the suburbs ever got out this far. It hit its peak in the early 21st century when a wave of newly rich old people had arrived here. Mary pedaled along the bike path, doing her best to stay out of everybody's way. Her guest pass was still valid, but kids were mostly second-class citizens at Rainbow's End. When she was young, visiting Lena here, she had thought the village was magical. There were real bronze statues. The colonnades and the brickwork were real too, finer than all but the most expensive shopping malls. Since then, she had studied senior issues in school, and there was no way to avoid certain cynical conclusions. There was some real money in Rainbow's End, but it was money spent by people who couldn't do better. Most of those who remained were living on vapor and biotech promises, unlucky in investment and or medicine. Orozco had not tried to follow her or cover his tracks. She had traced him eastward. He'd finally got his bike unfolded, and he was pedaling towards Mesita's subdivision. She watched with narrowed eyes. Could Juan Orozco be the punk who'd briefly hijacked Sharif at UCSD? No way. No. That had been a smart Alec who insisted on bragging. More important, Mr. Smart Alec was really competent and maybe as sharp as Mary herself. Okay, so there were more important things to think about. Now, Lena's house was at the far end of 2nd Street up. It was time to image and imagine. Now, she had thought a lot about this meeting, thinking all the things she might say, all the sad things she might see. And Mary had constructed a special vision. It was based on things she had been working on in some form since the 2nd grade. That's when she learned the personal significance of variant 12 in intractable osteoporosis. First, she made the trees along her path taller and wider, nothing like palms. And she climbed the hill, and their high leafiness was replaced by overarching boughs of long needled evergreens. Of course, Mary didn't have any physical support for this. She didn't have game stripes in her shirt, and she didn't have micro cooling, and that sun still beat on her, even if she made the sky overcast and the trees bend low. Maybe she should think of the heat as some sort of spell. She had thought of doing that before, but there were always other improvements that seemed to be more important. And after all the months of daydreaming, this vision was not beholden to any commercial art. It borrowed from 100 fantasies, but the effect was Mary's very own, For her concept of Lena, she had not put any of it in the public. Most visions were much more fun than when they were shared, but not this one. Finally, she lurched to a stop and got off the bike. The last couple hundred feet had to be on foot. There were a few older people around, but in her vision, they were unremarkable peasants. She saw the sidewalks and the wheelchair ramps as forest paths, mossy, time-worn steps, and she stumbled more than once on the inconsistencies, but that seemed only fair for a humble practitioner such as herself. And then she was in the inner grove. There were occasional side paths, evidence of cabins hidden deeper in the forest. Her trees were very old here, their branches high above her head, and Mary walked the bike along this ancient path. The people of the inner grove were higher rank, not in the category of Lena, but still powers to be respected. Mary kept her eyes on the ground and hoped that none of them would talk to her. She made the final turn and walked another 50 feet to a wide timbered cabin. And when she looked up, she could see breaks in the tree cover, but they didn't reveal sky. Instead, she was looking up into sun-touched green. The highest crown of the forest canopy stood right above this palace, the witchery of witches, the source of elder wisdom. And she leaned her bike against the timbers and reached up to hit the massive brass knocker. And the sound boomed loud in her ears. She ignored the junky 20th century melody that actually played. It was the old doorbell that Lena had brought in from Palo Alto. A moment passed. Mary heard footsteps from within. Footsteps. A huge door creaked inwards, and Mary's envisioning was confronted with a significant challenge. A woman not much older looking than the teachers at school. "What are you doing here?" Mary stared for a moment, speechless. She rarely hit surprises this big, and after a moment she recovered herself and nodded respectfully. "Zhu Zhang?" "Yes, you're Mary, aren't you? Lena's granddaughter." She stepped aside and gestured Mary in. I didn't know that you would recognize me," Mary said, stepping indoors, imagining madly. "Zhu Zhang looked too young to be a real witch. Okay, I'll make her be Lena's apprentice, a whatchamajoogle, a newbie witch." "Newbie," Zhang smiled. "Lena has shown me pictures of you. We even saw you at school once. Lena told me you would come around sooner or later." "So she'll see me?" "I'll ask her." Mary gave a little bow. "Thank you, ma'am." Newbie Zhang led Mary to an upholstered chair next to a book-laden desk. "I'll be right back." Mary settled in the chair. Oops, it was hard plastic. And as for the desk, well, those were real books, the kind some people use for just-in-time reading. That's good. Just in time. I guess that's what we're doing tonight. Just-in-time reading. Oh gosh, I've lost my place. The pages were whatever you wanted, but they were real pages. Of course, they were not as thick. They were not the thick and hoary things of Mary's imaging, but they were piled deep. There was a view page on top, very much out of place, and a confession of ineptitude. Mary quickly morphed it into a glowing grimoire. She edged forward in her chair and looked at the books. Mechanics and electrical engineering. Well, these would be newbie Zhang's. Mary had studied the background of all the students in Robert's classes. The box of toys under the desk must be things she'd built in shop class. Mary recognized the warp transport tray from the news. What was incredible coincidence was that Zhu Zhang was rooming with Lena. There were sounds behind her. The inner door was opening. It was newbie Zhang and the senior witch right behind them. Mary was ready with imagery for this. Lena's real chair had 6 small wheels on articulated axles, very practical and dull. But Mistress Gu's chair had tall wooden wheels, sheathed in silver and canted outward. Little blue sparks chased each other around the rims as it moved. And Mary imaged Lena dressed in heavy black, a black that absorbed the room's light in the classic magical way. A black that obscured the details of what it clothed. Lena's pointy-brimmed hat was hung jauntily from the chair's high back post, and that was where Mary's special effects ended. The rest she had always kept the way Lena really was. In fact, All her vision was to give her grandmother the proper frame, one that would reveal how wonderful she truly was. The senior witch looked Mary up and down and then said, "Didn't Bob tell you to let me be?" But she didn't sound as angry as Mary had feared. "Yes, but I miss you so much." Oh, she leaned forward slightly. "How is your mom, Mary? Is she okay?" "Alice is fine." Lena knew way too much about Alice, but she had no need to know. Besides, she couldn't help Alice. "I wanted to talk to you about some other things." Mistress Goose sighed and closed her deep set eyes, and when she opened them, she might have been smiling. "Well, I'm glad to see you, kiddo. It's just that I don't want to argue with you or Bob, and most of all, I don't want you know who to know that I am still around." "I'll only argue a little bit, Lena, as much as will make positive headway and still leave me welcome to come again. You don't have to worry about you know who." Mistress Goo's own wording was straight out of fantasy tradition, although it was sad that Robert would be cast as an ultimate evil. "I promise I won't reveal you to him, at least not without your permission. I took precautions coming here. Besides, you know who is no good at snooping." Lena shook her head. "That's what you think." Newbie Zhang sat down beside the wheelchair and watched them silently. Maybe she could help. "You see, you know who every day, don't you, madame?" "Yes," said Zhang, "in shop class and Louise Chumlig's search and analysis." "Miss Chumlig's not so bad, at least for bonehead classes." Mary was fast enough to squelch the additional comment, but she felt herself blush even so. Newbie Zhang didn't seem to notice. "In fact, she's quite good. I've been telling Lena." She glanced at the senior witch. "Louise knows things about asking questions that took me a lifetime to understand. And more than anyone, she has shown me the importance of analysis packages." She pointed at the old grimoire, and Mary was a little taken aback. Yes, Miss Chumlig was a nice person, but she was full of cliches. And she droned. But even Junior Witch is not someone you can contradict, and Mary was very anxious to be congenial. She dipped her head. "Yes, ma'am. Anyway, you see a lot of you know who. Is he really such a terrible person?" Xu Zhang shook her head. "He is strange. He looks so young. Robert, I mean, you know who, can be very gracious and then suddenly cut you dead. I've seen him do that to several children. The old people steer clear of him. I think Winston Blount hates him." Yes, Mary had watched Winston Blount in the UCSD library on Saturday. Most of her attention had been absorbed in the battle for the personas of Zulfikar Sharif, but she had not missed Blount's hostility. Newbie Zhang glanced at the frail lady in the wheelchair. "I'm afraid Lena is right about him. He uses people. He admired my shop project, and then he walked off with it." Lena cackled. That was something an elderly person could do well, in Mary's opinion. It was the only positive thing about old age. "Shuju, you told me you were thrilled to see him chop that car." Newbie Zhang looked embarrassed. "Well, yes, I got into science with model and homemade RF controllers, and I'd been nothing without hands-on experience. Nowadays, our access to real things is muffled by layers of automated bureaucracy." I'm just going to say that again. "Nowadays, our access to real things is muffled by layers of automated bureaucracy, and I guess my own SHE is partly to blame." So both Robert and I wanted to break something, and I cheered him on for acting. But what I wanted was of no concern to him. I was just a convenient tool. Lena laughed again. "You're so lucky. You learned in days what it took me years." She raised a clawed hand to wipe at her hair. Modern medicine had not completely failed Lena Gu. 5 years ago, she'd had Parkinson's, and Mary remembered the tremors. Modern medicine had reversed her Parkinson's, kept her mind sharp, and stopped various ills, large and small, but her abnormal osteoporosis was still beyond cure. As far back as the second grade, Mary had been able to understand the technical why of that. The moral why was something even Alice couldn't explain. Mary looked into the wizened face of the senior witch. I'm glad it took you years to see through you know who. Otherwise, you two would never have had Bob and raised him to marry Alice, and I would never be." Lena looked away. "Yes," she grumped. "Bobby was the only reason I stayed with your grandfather. We gave Bobby a good home. And he was halfway human with the boy. At least it was clear he couldn't run Bobby's adult life. By that time, Bob had escaped to the Marine Corps. Her gaze flickered back to Mary. I congratulate myself on that. I made terrible mistakes in marrying your grandfather, but it brought two lovely lives into existence, and it only cost me 20 years. Don't you ever miss him? Mistress Goo's eyes narrowed. That's coming perilously close to arguing with me, young lady. Sorry. Mary came over to kneel on the floor beside Lena's wheelchair. She reached out to hold Lena's hand. The old woman smiled. She knew it was coming, but she didn't have to have completely effective defenses. You had all those years apart from him. I remember you visiting back when you know who was well and never visited. And even then, Lena had been a little old lady, a busy doctor who smiled at most when she was talking to Mary. Were you happy then? Of course, all those years I was free of the monster. But when you know who began to lose his mind, then you helped him. Lena rolled her eyes and looked at newbie Zhang. When I say the word, you kick the brat back out on the street. Zhang looked uncertain. Okay. But not just yet. Lena looked back at Mary. We've been over this ground before, Mary. Bob came here to Rainbow's End and begged me to help, remember? And he brought you along with him, and Bob was never understood how things were between Robert and me. God bless him, he doesn't realize that all the affection he saw was just for him. But between his pleading and your cute little face, I agreed to help out with the monster's final years. And you know, sometimes dementia softens a person up. There was a year or so when Robert was nearly helpless, but he could still recognize people and remember our years together. And there was a time when he was tractable and we actually got along for a while. Mary nodded. And then they figured out how to cure Robert's brand of dementia. And by then your grandfather had declined from tractability into a kind of a veggie state. Mary, I would have stuck with him through the end if there hadn't been the miracle cure. But I could see what was coming. The monster would be back. Lena punched a crooked finger in her granddaughter's direction. Burn me once, shame on him. Burn me twice, shame on me. And so I stay out of the picture, you understand. But her other hand remained in Mary's, and the girl gave it a squeeze. But couldn't this be different? By the time they cured grandfather, part of them had almost already died. That had been Jin Lee's theory, not Mary. I know he's angry now, but that's because he's lost a lot. Maybe the things you remember are gone too. Lena waved her free hand in the direction of newbie Zhang. Did you hear what Zhu just said about the nobleness of his character? Mary thought fast. It never worked to agree with Alice, but sometimes a quick change of subject could distract Bob. She glanced at newbie Zhang. Lena, you've been living here since grandfather's been sick, and you could have moved anywhere since you don't visit us anymore, but you're still just 10 miles away. Lena's chin came up. I've lived in San Diego for years, and I'm not going to give up seeing my friends, shopping the old stores, hiking. Well, I have given up on hiking. But the point is, even resurrected, you-know-who is not going to run my life. But very thin ice here. Did you know Dr. Zhang before? The senior witch's lips thinned. No, and now you're going to point out more or less plaintive silence imply that since there are 2,500 old folks here at Rainbow's End, this matchup couldn't be coincidence. Mary was silent. Finally, newbie Zhang spoke up. It was my choice. I moved down here this summer about the time I got my get up and go back. I'm one of the older people living at Rainbow's End, but I'm bright and bubbly. A strange, sad smile. And they don't know what to do with me, and so I volunteered to be a roommate. It's worked out well. Your grandma's 10 years younger than I am, but that doesn't mean much at our age. She gave Lena's shoulder a pat. Mary remembered that Lena Llewellyn-Gu had done years of psychiatric consulting here at Rainbow's End. If anyone could arrange a matchup with Zhu Zhang, it was her. She opened her mouth to remark on this and noticed a warning glare in Lena's eyes, as clear as any silent messaging could ever be. After a moment, Lena shifted in her chair. See, my girl, pure coincidence, but I do admit it's been useful, Zhu, keeping me advised of you-know-whose adventures in modern education. And she gave a nasty, witchy smile that needed no help from Mary for special effects. Yes, said Zhang. Well, we have our collective eyes on him. The monster is not going to catch up with me this time. Mary rocked back. You're running a joint entity? She hadn't dreamed two witches could be so truly modernly magical. A what? A joint entity. Partners with complementary strengths and weaknesses. In public, you are one, represented by the mobile partner. But what you can do and understand is the best of each of you. Zhang stared at her without comprehension. Oh, Miri pinged both women, except for Lena's medicals. They were both fully offline. Miri had been too distracted by her own imagining. You aren't wearing, are you? Zhu gestured at her desk. I mean, I have my view page in these books. I'm trying to learn so many serious things, Miri. I don't have time to bother with wearing. Miri almost forgot her mission. Dr. Zhang, you are so wrong about wearables. I mean, hasn't Ms. Chumling talked about that? Some analysis packages don't have traction if you run them with static video. Newbie Zhang gave a reluctant nod. She showed Blast 9, but that just seems to be molecular design dressed up as a game toy nonsense. But you've only run them on your view page. The younger witch hunched down. I have so much to learn, Miri. I'm working through the simpler things. What can I run on the view page? Lena watched the other woman for a second, and then she seemed to wilt back into her wheelchair. She looked down at her granddaughter. Poor Miri, you don't understand. You live in a time that thinks it can ignore the human condition. She cocked her head. You never read Secrets of the Ages, did you? Of course I read it. I'm sorry, Miri. I mean, I'm sure you have. After all, it's my beloathed ex-husband's most famous achievement. And I'll give him this. Those poems are works of genius. Their implacable weight is all his hurtfulness turned to support. But you can't see that, can you, Mary? Because you're surrounded by medical promises and halfway cures, and it distracts you from the bedrock of reality. She paused and her head bobbed. It was almost like her old palsy, but maybe this was simply indecision, wondering whether to stay or more. Mary, the truth is, if we are careful and lucky, we live to be old and weak and very, very tired. And then there comes an end to striving. No, you'll get better, Lena. You've just had bad luck. It's just a matter of time. There was a whisper of witchly cackle, and Mary remembered that "it's just a matter of time" was the mantra of Robert's poem cycle. And for a moment, grandmother and granddaughter glared certainty at each other. And then Lena said, and this is about where I figured out our chat would come. I'm sorry, Mary. Mary bowed her head. But I just want to help. Strange, that had been the Orozco's kid's whine. To Mary, okay, so maybe he wasn't a complete jerk, and maybe he could help. But there was something else he'd said, and right now it was much more important. Yes, suddenly Mary saw how she could turn defeat into victory. She looked up into her grandmother's face and smiled innocently. Did you know, Lena, that you know who is learning to wear? And that's the end of that chapter. And that was over a good amount over an hour tonight. So 2 chapters, we'll stick it with 2 chapters. And the one for next time is chapter 14, The Mysterious Stranger. So anyway, thanks for joining in. Good night, everybody.